So my name is John Maloney. I'm Vice Chairman of the Beef Plan Movement. We have Eamon Corley, our Chairman, and Emmanuel Ledee, one of our directors here. In Boston by Professor Richard Lindzen. So welcome, Richard. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So just for people that aren't aware or familiar with your work, I'm just going to give a quick background of what you've done to date. So Richard Lindzen is an atmospheric physicist and meteorologist with over 200 publications. All his academic degrees are from Harvard University. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science, the American Geophysical Union, the American Meteorological Society, and the American Association of Advancement of Science. He is an Alfred P. Sloan Professor of Atmospheric Science at MIT. He is currently Professor Emeritus at MIT, and you're currently doing research into climate sensitivity. So I think I've covered some of the points there, not all of them, but so I'm just going to jump straight into this and kick off with a question. So presently, you're probably aware that farmers are protesting right across Europe. And one of the main reasons for these protests is policymakers are trying to reduce farm productivity in a bid to curb climate emergency or climate catastrophe. I'm just interested in your views on climate catastrophe, and do you believe the climate models are accurate in predicting this?
Well, let me say for the start, it has nothing to do with the models. Let me explain what I'm saying. I'll have a few slides. I'll try and share screen with you, and I'll speak for about 5-10 minutes. Is that okay, John?
Great, that's brilliant. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Here is my talk, and here's its title: The Unanswerable Case Against Limiting Methane and Nitrous Oxide. And I'd like you to pay attention to this because it's been pretty clear, John, that you are learning about the narrative of global warming as applied to CO2. And that isn't the situation with methane and nitrous oxide. Let me just switch to the, yeah. Okay. Now, let me start with something that caused me to change my talk. I went with my wife to a Chinese restaurant a couple of days ago, and I got a fortune cookie that had the following written: keep it simple. The more you say, the less audience remembers. And I propose to take this good advice. I also attended a recent inaugural meeting of something called the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. And I concluded that responsible citizenship requires that you do your homework. And in the case of agriculture, you really don't have to do much homework. All you have to do is understand the following that I thought Will Happer had given a talk in Ireland on. And I'll include parenthetical comments to help you understand what he said. Now, let's start with the usual case against methane and nitrous oxide when it comes to fertilizer and so on. The forcing, and by that we mean the additional warming per added methane molecule, is about 30 times the forcing per added carbon dioxide molecule. And the forcing per added nitrous oxide molecule is about 230 times the forcing per added CO2 molecule. Now, these are the alleged reasons that politicians are allegedly concerned about these agriculturally relevant molecules. Now, why is this difference existing? Well, it's due to the fact that CO2 is what is called saturated compared to the minor saturation of methane and nitrous oxide. What I mean by that, and the easiest thing is using the analogy of paint. With paint, there as with paint, there is already so much CO2 that it appears black with respect to infrared. And adding more leaves it black. It doesn't do much. On the other hand, there is so little methane and nitrous oxide that they are almost transparent. And so each molecule does a lot more. Okay, that's the case. But there is an additional feature. Namely, the rate of increase of methane is 300 times less than that of CO2. And so CH4, methane, only contributes 1/10 of the increased forcing per year that CO2 does. And the rate of increase of N2O is 3,000 times less. So nitrous oxide contributes only about 1/13 as much forcing per year as CO2. Thus, even models with unreasonably large response to CO2 will produce an indiscernible response to methane and nitrous oxide. It's worth noting that the above argument overstates the impact of methane and nitrous oxide, because as their concentration increases, they too start to saturate. In brief, shutting down emissions of methane and nitrous oxide globally, forget Little Ireland, will have no discernible impact on the climate metric, this so-called globally average temperature anomaly, regardless of what you believe about global warming or which model you are using. Your leaders pretend they are displaying virtue and power. On the contrary, they are showing their ignorance and malice. Stick to the above and you will win, because quite frankly, they have no answer to the above. Their policies with respect to agriculture involve huge cost and pain for no benefit whatever, regardless of what one believes about climate. You owe it to yourselves, to Ireland, and the world to win this battle against malicious insanity. Good luck. That's my talk.
Actually, there is one question that I suppose just when you highlight the fact the impact of methane and nitrous oxide is so indiscernible by comparison to CO2, and it's something that kind of bugs me, is that the G100, the way they calculate carbon dioxide, the impact of carbon dioxide, like, are they not understating the longevity of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Because they only count the first 100 years, and carbon dioxide is up there for hundreds of years.
Well,
so
that isn't true, first of all.
Okay.
It has, you never, how shall I put it? With all of these things, after 1 billion years, there will be some left. It exponentially decays with an exponential time scale. The time scale for CO2 is closer to 40 years. Sure, after 200 years, there are a few molecules left, but that's the E-folding time. The lifetime of methane is much less, and I know that's been emphasized. But that doesn't matter at all, given how little of it is emitted compared to how much is emitted of CO2. And so if CO2, they say, will give somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees, no matter which of those, and 4.5 is now ruled out, 3 is ruled out, but even if it gave that, what would methane do? 0.45. Nobody says that's a big deal. And certainly not a big deal compared to CO2, which itself is not a big deal, because frankly, a few degrees, the temperature difference between breakfast and lunch, is not something we don't know how to deal with. So I'm saying, understand this argument. It depends on the rate of emission, That's the only thing relevant for the heating per year. And it's saying you guys are doing nothing that can be measured. And so to ruin either plant life for lack of fertilizer in Sri Lanka, cattle in Ireland, in Holland, this is insanity.
And just on that, Richard, I was watching the news here in Ireland there 2 nights ago, and they were speaking about cutting emissions. And on the main screen of the TV, they had a picture of factory pipes bellowing out smoke, and right beside that, they had a picture of livestock in a field.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, what do you think their motivation is for focusing so hard on agriculture, of all things? Why would they want to cut food production in a world where the population is growing?
Yeah, it's malice.
Mm.
Politicians love power. They love exerting, showing their virtue. They love pushing people around. I've often thought there is a pathology associated with politics. But in this case, and I'm assuring you of this, you have a rock solid argument. And they can say the model show this, the model show that. It doesn't matter. That's your strength at this point. I know that you've been trying to understand what the climate issue is and so on, how the models work and this and that and so on. Don't get into the weeds. You don't need to on this issue.
And just one argument they always throw at us is that 97% of scientists agree with them.
Not with this. Not with this.
Not with this.
Probably 100% agree that adding CO2 will cause some warming. Probably no more than 1% agree that it is an existential threat.
Okay. Okay.
Why do you think that narrative? Sorry, Professor. Why do you think that narrative is allowed to persist in the mainstream? And I mean, like for example, for us, the first signal for agriculture was on the front line was the Eat Lancet journal, that article that proclaimed that, you know, in order to save the planet, we need to cut down our meat consumption based on the population doubling.
Something Orwell has pushed years ago. There's something in the socialist mentality that yearns for vegetarianism. Don't ask me why.
It's bizarre that for me, what is the biggest risk to humanity, for example, if the consequence of climate change, one of the biggest risks is food security. I mean, that's the major issue. What they're predicting is droughts and famines, and
let me say something.
What they target is actually food production. They want to remove food production to avoid famines in the future.
They don't care. I mean, you know, what should I say? I mean, it makes no sense. It's just virtue signaling, it's exercise of power. But on top of all that, and that's something where I think homework comes in. If you go to the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they issue tons of reports, and all except one each time is by bureaucrats. But there is one that is the science report. It is about 1,000 pages. It's unreadable. It's not meant to be read. But if you bother to go through it and your livelihoods are at stake, the welfare of Ireland is at stake, it probably pays to look at it, because nowhere in that does it suggest that we're dealing with an existential threat. The threat it's talking about is one that says by 2100, the GDP, at least in the US, will be 200% of what it is today, but due to climate change, it'll only be 197%. That doesn't sound like an existential threat to me.
Yeah, and that's what they say when they speak of the impending cost to the economy. They're not factoring in the fact that the economy is going to get richer in those 70 years.
No.
Yes.
The trouble with this issue is there is no point at all at which it's right including the metric for climate, this global mean temperature anomaly. I mean, the Earth has dozens of climate regimes. Each of them has a different physical meaning. They're not all in lockstep with that 1 degree change in 150 years. But the trouble with that is everyone looking at it, depending on what their specialty is, said, that's wrong. And, so they focus on that. One will say, well, it's not CO2, it's the solar cycle. But the solar cycle is also only one thing. Climate is not one thing. You have people saying, well, there was the medieval optimum. And others say, but it's only Europe. And for the Earth as a whole, it averaged out to 0. Hey, that says for a couple of 100 years, Europe was warmer than it is today. And for a couple of 100 years, the rest of the world was colder. Is that not a climate change? Of course it is. But they're saying since it averaged it out, it doesn't count. That's stupid. But the problem is every point along the way is stupid. And you get stuck on the one you're familiar with, and you forget that the whole thing makes no sense.
If I can just ask a quick question, John, are you saying that if the world basically does nothing, if we increase flights, if we increase the burning of fossil fuels,
Okay.
that we'll still be okay, and we don't have a major disaster coming?
Let's dissect that a little. Remember what I said. I said the CO2 issue is a harder one to argue because you have to go through the sensitivity, you have to go the nature of heat transport in the atmosphere and so on. I'm saying that when it comes to methane and nitrous oxide, none of that matters. You've got an ironclad case against it. And even if the jet planes caused a problem, you're not. So that's, essentially I'm saying stay out of the weeds on the climate change issue. You have a case that is unassailable, that doesn't depend on what one thinks about climate. If you ask me personally that question, I would agree. You could fly all you want and it ain't gonna make a discernible difference. And the difference it'll make is probably benign and beneficial. Because CO2 is free plant food. We already see it increases arable land. Most people do not retire to the Arctic. They retire to Florida, to the Mediterranean. The whole notion that a couple of degrees warming is going to just drive people crazy. You have Holland already under sea level. They do very well. We know how to manage it. That's why God gave us a brain.
That's very good.
Yeah, but just on the methane argument, and one thing that I find like a contradiction in terms, and it's the environmental debate seems to be very contradictory in all terms, and like methane is natural gas. It is the preferred fuel of the green lobby. They want to transition everyone away from dirty coal and oil into renewables supported by gas.
Look. I can only speculate on that, but there's one thing that's been obvious. Since the first Earth Day in 1970, the green movement has forgotten about whales. It's forgotten about biodiversity, all that. It's focused on the energy sector. And why the energy sector? The energy sector in the US is the only sector where you think in terms of trillions of dollars. And when you're thinking of trillions of dollars, look, Biden in his, Inflation Reduction Act has $9 trillion budgeted for climate. Somebody's going to get those 9 trillion. Now, I mean, energy is an obvious target, but it's not a meaningful one because, you know, you have billions of people who are suffering from no energy, virtually. They're cooking with dung in their shack. You know, you have all sorts of insane cruelty. The World Bank refuses to fund a hospital in the Congo Republic unless it uses renewable energy in lieu of fossil fuels. Which of those bureaucrats would like to be operated in a hospital running on intermittent energy? I mean, it's, you know, it's a world gone mad. And I'm saying you're fortunate in the case of methane and nitrous oxide for other agriculture that you don't depend on their models and so on and so forth. You depend on simply very well measured emission rates. And the emission rates for you guys is so low that if the whole world killed all its cattle and buried them 7 feet under, it wouldn't make a measurable difference.
Oh,
And that's kind of the point, that most of the emissions are, for example, I know that I saw a recent statistic where over the last decade, there was like a 6% reduction in livestock numbers worldwide. But at that time, over that time, we've had a peak increase in methane accumulations in the atmosphere. So most of it is actually coming from the green strategy to use more gas, which is leading to more leakage and more, so it's the fossil fuel industry that's generating most of the emissions in methane's case.
Just leave it. Focus your argument on something that is incontestable and just say, ask them to explain what they hope to get out of this.
So you're advising just ask the powers that be to quantify the impact of removing what impact will it have to remove all?
I've given you the results.
Yeah, which is
they're an overestimate of the role of methane and nitrous oxide. Understand why the molecules are so powerful. It's because you have so few of them. If you had so little CO2, granted, you wouldn't have life if you had so little CO2, it too would be very powerful. But after the first 50 parts per million, it began saturating.
okay. Just, we had a question there from one of our members, and they asked if it's true that if you don't agree with the climate catastrophe model or the climate emergency, you don't get funding if you're a scientist. So,
That's
the
true.
case?
That's pretty much true. I mean, I don't know if you're following the idiotic politics of the US at this point with wokeness and so on, and the march through the institutions, the way the universities were captured and so on, which is true enough. But in the 60s, the time of the Vietnam War, a large anti-American mood set in among many of the academics. Partly, you can speculate on the reasons, but the war was being fought by working class kids, and kids in college didn't want to go. It's continued pretty much that way with deindustrialization and so on. I mean, it's a sad situation. But what can you say about it? I mean, this has nothing to do with science. And yet, with the internet and so on, there's been much more control of things. And marching through the institutions, some of the institutions that were captured immediately were professional societies, the American Meteorological Society, the American Geophysical Union, even the National Academy. Now, what's the role of these societies? Why are they so easy to capture? Because the people who belong to these associations want to get on with their work. So they hire an executive director And you suddenly have one hired employee who speaks for thousands of people who never are asked their opinion. So these guys get locked in. Then they went for the National Science Foundation. And there they saw this was an opportunity for funding and so on. It took about 10 more years to capture the other funding agencies. For a while, NASA, the Department of Energy, continued funding. But do you remember the ClimateGate emails? Had you ever heard of them?
I have, yeah, to do with the hockey stick curve and that.
That isn't the important point for your question. They were talking about how to get rid of journals that published articles that questioned it, how to stop it. So, for instance, I had enough prestige to publish a couple of articles in the AMS Bulletin. One of them was in 1990. It was refereed, it was accepted, it was published, and immediately the editor was fired. 10 years later, I published a paper dealing with something called the iris effect. Again, the editor was fired that day.
Wow. Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah, no, you're dealing with a kind of coup. And, when they say 97% of science, it was in 1988 when this issue was rolled out in the States. Newsweek magazine, which then existed, it may still exist for all I know, had a cover. It showed the Earth on fire, and the script underneath said, "All scientists agree." This was at a time when almost no scientists agreed, when the heads of major labs in the UK and the US and Russia all agreed this didn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Professor, do you not have a concern? I mean, science as a I mean, science has been the single thing that has progressed mankind over the last 300 years. It's science has taken us out of the dark ages, and science has proven a lot of ideologies wrong. It was through scientific means that an awful lot of our beliefs were challenged, and they actually, I mean, it saved lives. It's made us what we are. And I know that would you not be concerned that, like, I always have a belief that science can be proven, and yet,
No.
despite that, science now is being corrupted to being something populist.
Science can be disproven.
Yes.
Proven.
Yes, true. Actually, very accurate. Apologies, but the thing is that it's accepted until disproven, and
how shall I put it? Let's get something straight. Science is a mode of inquiry. It is not a source of authority. Science is the only word I know which becomes its opposite when preceded by the definite article the. The science is the opposite of science. Whenever you hear that, we support the science, take cover.
Yeah.
Whenever you hear that, we support the science, take cover.
Yeah. we have that. We're actually dealing with that at the moment in relation to an authority on breeding programs, and they say that it's all sound based on the science. So, but I mean, it's not sound. It doesn't stand up to scrutiny when you look at it in real terms.
Now, a friend of mine, Steve Koonin, wrote a book called Unsettled. Now, Steve is a physicist, and he knows very little about climate, and he doesn't pretend to. He is simply basing that book on the official, quote, sources. The IPCC, the US National Assessments, all this sort of stuff. And he's pointing out, these sources never tell you that you're dealing with a severe threat. These sources never tell you that the only thing you can do is mitigate. It seems easy enough to adapt. And, you know, so he's going at it without questioning the underlying science. The underlying science, however, is corrupted by the political scheme. So I'll give you an example. For instance, the third UN assessment came out with this funny statement that they are now pretty damn certain that most of the warming since 1960 is due to man. Turns out that's nonsense, but doesn't matter. It's an innocent statement because it's most consistent with it not being much of a problem, because there hasn't been that much warming since 1960. We're talking about a fraction of a degree. But they don't elaborate on it. And so what was the political response in the US? Well, you had Senators McCain as a Democrat, and McCain as a Republican, and Lieberman as a Democrat, both concluding this was the smoking gun and we must do something. And the something usually involves increased funding for climate. So nobody complains.
And do you think funding has a big part to play in the IPCC as well when they release these catastrophic predictions?
At this point, yes, and before yes. What you have in the US was, roughly speaking, between the end of George H.W. Bush's term as president and the beginning of Al Gore and Domain is with, you know, the funding went up about a factor of 15.
Oh.
So, you know, Clinton, Gore did most of it. And a lot of the funding is, you know, for renewable energy and so on. But it was a huge increase. And I think, you know, for instance, you started out with a very small field. Climate science, there are maybe a handful of departments in the US. The biggest laboratory for climate science was in the Soviet Union at that time, the main geophysical observatory in what was then Leningrad. All of a sudden, every university has a climate group. And that's from the factor of 15. Now, things have changed a little. The funding didn't continue to increase at that rate. And lots of people entered the field because of the funding. It became a much larger field. I mean, to anyone who worked in climate, even in the early 90s, to hear about thousands of the world's leading climate scientists sounds ludicrous. I mean, it was a handful. But by then, you did have lots of people who called themselves climates. Incidentally, in 1990, no one at MIT called themselves a climate scientist. It was too broad an interdisciplinary area. You were a meteorologist, an oceanographer, a marine geochemist, and so on. All of a sudden, everyone is a climate scientist. Now, the vast majority don't know anything about the physics of climate, but you know, you now have large numbers. And these numbers need funding, even though it's not increasing. And the funding increasingly is going to renewable energy and so on. So they will continue to beat this drum, hoping to at least not lose funding. Ironies. When you had big climate change, you know, the glaciation cycles, the Eocene 50 million years ago, that was almost entirely due to changes in the temperature between the tropics and the pole. If you look at the change we've had over the last 150 years, it's almost entirely due to the tropics and not the change in the temperature difference. To account for this, there was an imaginary claim that you have polar amplification, but that isn't how the system works.
Yeah, the main warming happens in the tropics. That's where the greenhouse gases have the most effect.
Right now, but not when you had major climate change.
Oh, okay. So that warming dissipates then to other parts of the planet from the tropics. So it's kind
The
of
extratropics behave very differently, and their change between the tropics and the pole are due to hydrodynamic processes.
okay.
And just Richard,
That's getting into the weeds and in
Yeah.
an interesting subject. What I'm trying to tell you is you don't have to do that with respect to methane.
and just Richard, I think today in Europe a law was passed to flood 1/5 of the agricultural land in Ireland, again to combat climate change. Now, currently, if we speak up and we say, you know, some of the things that you've been telling us there for the last 15 minutes, that they'll say that we're climate change denialists, and they won't even listen to us. How do you think we should combat this madness? You know, what should our strategy be?
I think the first thing you do is I'll send you the notes that I used. Try to make sure you understand them. Once you understand what I've said, I think you'll be much more confident in saying this, and they can call you names all they wish, but insist that they explain what's wrong with what you've said. And if they can't say it, stand up. Don't be cowards. Don't be intimidated. You don't have to understand climate to understand why you are being unfairly treated, idiotically treated. You have a great advantage over the energy sector.
Good, thanks for that, Chet.
Do you have any more questions?
Well, just there is one argument that is being made, is that the argument for the focus on methane, and I know that the last or second last COP in Scotland, they formed an agreement for methane reduction or to cap it or something like that. I remember Biden was over there and President Biden was over and it was one of the breakthroughs of that.
Biden, confronted with the possibility of nuclear war, saying that isn't the real danger. The danger is existential climate threat.
I know. But the only thing though is the argument that is being made, or that I've heard articulated, was that they know that the methane portion of the warming is quite small, but what they're hoping, because the response is 12 years, so a reduction of methane will take less than 12 years or to actually see actual results. So the argument I've heard is that it's a quicker response to give sort of headroom to allow the CO2 issue to be addressed.
Doesn't get any place, period. The lifetime is a red herring. It's true enough, but the fact that it saturates as you get more is even more important. But what I'm saying is, take your time, understand what I've said.
And I think that's, yeah, I think it's the saturation bit is, for me, it's the bit I need to get my head around, because I understand what you're saying, that the densities, I know we're talking about parts per billion or versus parts per million for the
it's going up much less, the rate.
It's only 17 parts per billion a year, I think, is what is been reported.
Essentially, what I'm saying is, you could go to the extreme of getting rid of all your cattle in the whole world, and it wouldn't make a difference. And that doesn't depend on your model, and it doesn't depend on your theory of climate change. I mean, what more could you ask for if you had to defend yourself on it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's great. I think we've gone way over time. Thanks very much for giving us so much time, Richard.
Should I